Hello.
Great to see you both.
I'm so glad we all have internet after, I don't know if either of you got some of those fun windstorms. We had to literally pack and run like an hour away to get internet and power yesterday, and
No
the whole
way.
neighborhood was doing the same thing. Everyone,
Oh my
like
God.
cars on the road, it was like apocalypse now. Everybody, get the kids, jump in the car,
Well, yeah,
head
your
out.
laptop's on the roof of the car. Going, where's
Almost. We
Oh
actually
boy.
laid sonic fiber here recently, and yesterday it
Wow.
turned on. So we had both Comcast and Sonic going at the same time, and one went out, Comcast went out, or Xfinity went out, but we had Sonic, so we made it through yesterday. But it's been hairy with the wind and rain
Yeah.
here in the Bay Area. That's where
Weather is crazy everywhere.
Yeah.
So folks, I know we've got folks joining us right now as we speak. So first off, just thanks for joining us live today. And as our guests and folks trickle in, we would love to know where you're dialing in from. So feel free to just drop in the chat your name and where you're calling in from, so we can get a better sense for the HR community that we have on the line with us. And maybe on that note, maybe Sarah and Ellen, where are you two dialing in from? Sarah, why don't you start?
I am dialing in from Walnut Creek, California, which is just outside the Bay Area. So that's why we were talking about all the windstorms, as we have, downed fences, down power lines. It was super fun.
Nice. Elle, how about you?
And in the Bay Area as well. So I'm in Oakland, California. So right in the heart of all the good rain, but we need it. So I'm going to stop complaining.
I was going to say, for all those people like in Minnesota and Wisconsin, they're like, can you Californians please shut up complaining about the weather? Like,
I know.
I'm like, sorry.
We're so used to perfect. It's really hard when it's not.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you everyone for dropping in. We got folks from everywhere: Birmingham, Alabama, Rhode Island, San Francisco, New York, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. It's amazing. Wisconsin. Welcome everyone. One other note: we're just getting ready to get started. And a reminder for the folks who are on the line, as we dive into this discussion, please feel free to drop questions and comments into the chat directly. I know Sarah and Elle love to just respond and kind of and incorporate that into our thinking. So, and we also believe that this is just a much more engaging and valuable conversation when those questions actually come out into the dialogue and the discussion. And I think we are ready to get started. Just a couple of minutes in, so why don't we dive in? I'll kick off with a little bit of a preamble and an intro, and then we can hit the topic. But first off, just thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got a really great group of HR leaders who've registered in from across the country. I think we've got over 110 folks registered, contributing to the conversation and taking things away. And as the title says, what we're looking at here is really oriented around how do you compose the perfect benefits proposal? And this is a part of a 3-part series oriented around designing your benefit strategy in a fluctuating economy. We're in a backdrop that is just quite challenging when it comes to the HR community and HR leaders trying to design the right benefit strategy for their organizations. And this is part 2 in a 3-part series. So last month, we walked through step 1, which was how do you gather the data needed to set that strategy, the key inputs there. And if you missed that session, it looks like I just got a question from Jeremiah. We're going to drop that recording into the chat. It is available live. It was a really good session. I highly recommend folks who haven't tuned into that session, please do. It sets the foundation for everything that we're talking about. So we'll have you there. Today, we're covering how do you create your perfect proposal for your executive team, and so that they buy into your plan and you really get alignment. And then next month, we're going to dive into implementation. So how do you implement that strategy? What to do, what to avoid to make it go smoothly from decision through enrollment and, frankly, post-enrollment auditing as well. So really tactical stuff meant to really arm the HR folks that are on the call with tools that they can use in this year ahead. So before we dive in, I'm going to do some brief introductions. First off, I'm Brandon Weber. I'm CEO and co-founder of Nava Benefits. For those of you that are just getting to know us, Nava is the first benefits brokerage oriented entirely around the mission to provide high quality, affordable healthcare to all Americans. That mission statement guides every decision that we make, how we hire, how we think about strategy. And we're doing that by bringing the tools, playbook, and thought leadership of America's largest employers down market to make great benefits easier for mid-sized employers and the HR teams that serve them. This is oriented around how do we make them easier to understand, easier to implement, and easier on HR teams. And I am super excited and very grateful to have two amazing thought leaders from larger companies and sophisticated organizations in the HR space. First is Sara Richards, Director of Benefits at Red Bull. And just below her is Ellen Meza, Total Rewards and People Operations Executive. She was most recently at DocuSign. And both of these folks are on Nava's advisory board, and we're just super lucky to have them both guiding us in terms of what we do and guiding our clients in the community and through conversations like this and direct mentorship. So with that, I am going to dive in. Sara, Al, you ready?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. We're all fired up. Sara's got her headset on. She's just ready to rock.
I'm mission control.
No, totally. Awesome. And so, you know, as we said in the kickoff too, the last few years have been really challenging for HR and employers in general. And now we find ourselves in 2023 in a place where we have this unpredictable and fluctuating economy and kind of a backdrop where if you're trying to manage HR and manage benefits, you are responsible for one of your company's largest line items in terms of spend, and in a very dynamic environment where people are really thoughtful about cost and ROI and scrutinizing all this stuff. So this series is really trying to build a blueprint for delivering the optimal benefit strategy in an environment like this. And I want to set the table because we were actually, just before we jumped on, we were talking about how important that first session was for this session. And so I'll just recap some of the takeaways there. Last month, we really broke down how do you gather the data and the context, the goals and the constraints needed to set this strategy that we're talking about today. And really kind of came down to three things: aligning with leadership on strategy, goals, and constraints. Number two was analysis of what you have today and how it's working and how it's being engaged with. And then third was pinpointing what your employees want and need. So those are the three big things. We talked in detail about just how you get those things done, what best practices look like. And today we're diving into step two, the meat and potatoes of your strategy, which is building that proposal to get buy-in from your stakeholders now that you've done the work to gather that data and the context. So with that, we're going to focus on a few different components here. How do you build the kind of backlist or the prioritized backlog for your proposal? How do you think about this type of proposal depending on where your company is? Is it growing? Is it cutting? Is it holding firm? How to set expectations with your leadership team through the process so that you bring them along and you get buy-in. And then finally, really interesting one, which is navigating kind of the emotional side of benefits decision-making, because this can be a very highly charged topic for everyone involved. So let's dive in. That's enough about kind of the overview. Why don't we start with what a proposal looks like? What does a great proposal look like? And what does it accomplish? And Sara, maybe I'll hand the mic to you to just start kind of shaping this up, taking this from like abstract into more of a concrete, artifact, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the keys that we need to keep in mind is that any good proposal starts with storytelling. That is how you get people aligned. That is how you bring them along the journey. And so when you are creating your proposal, this shouldn't just be, here's my 3 slides about what I want to do with our company. This should be, hey guys, here's what I've heard from you about what's important to us as a company. Now, here's the landscape that we're working in. And if we want to meet these goals that you have said you want to meet and you want our help with, then here's what I'm thinking we need to do, and here's why. And so for me, a great proposal is, quite honestly, it's a sales pitch. And it is, you're trying to bring them along about why they should buy into what you're proposing, but you're also using this as a chance to show them, I've given this thought. This was not something that I am just slapping up on a board and I'm like, oh, there is thought behind it and there's logic behind it, because it doesn't matter what you do, you will get pushback from employees at some point. But if you have that underlying, here is why we made the decisions we did, it makes it a lot easier to have those answers ready about, here's why we focused on this year, because there was logic. These weren't just random choices that we made because we needed to save, X amount of money.
I love that. The storytelling, I think, frame is actually a powerful frame to think about how you go and build that out. Elle, how about you? What are some additional
Yeah,
components?
well, no, and I think that's the thing that you also want to do is we talked about in the first session about sort of bringing your executive team along, giving them some insight onto sort of what you're thinking about, what you're hearing on the street. This is your chance to now put that on paper, as it were, right? So there's also some thought into how you display that information. Remember, you're talking to people you need buy-in from. So are you doing it in a PowerPoint, in a Google Doc, in a, whatever, a Word doc? The how you actually physically present that actually matters too. So you want to be thoughtful and understand how your leaders absorb information and how to get the best decisions out of them, right? So I've spent a lot of time in my career focusing on like how to speak to an executive, both verbally, but also on paper, right? So in an email and a PowerPoint presentation, because I love detail. I mean, that's why I loved session one, was like, ooh, it's all about, building the framework for the story. But they don't need all of that, right? They've hired you, they trust you. You have to believe that. And now you're sort of presenting to them your ideas and your recommendations. And so on top of storytelling, it's in a format that makes sense for your executive team. It's in line with what you've already talked to them about. So be confident about that. And again, it's about using your data to be able to outline the story and align it with all, sort of the goals that you've set for both your team, your mission, but also the company's, goals and their values and everything they're trying to achieve. So I think that, plus one to what everything Sarah said, but also really think about the formatting, that it should really flow seamlessly from that first conversation that you've had, and build it in the way that makes sense for your organization. So there may be a template that exists on, how you should present your proposal, but make it your own, because honestly, I think we're all just a little bit different, and our organizations are different, and how our executives absorb information may be different than any other organization.
And let me just add to that, Elle, because I think that exec summary piece is so critical for people. And if you have not created an exec summary before, look at some of the reports you've seen from your carriers, or ask your broker, hey, do you have executive summary slide templates to give you ideas and to get your kind of mind starting to run on how do I take this detailed data and raise it up to their level? And I think the other thing to remember when you're putting this deck together is that kind of golden rule of you need to tell people stuff 3 times for it to sink in. So at the start, when you open the deck, you're like, here's what I'm going to tell you. Now I'm going to tell it to you. Now I'm going to remind you of what I just told you. And hopefully by the end of that, some of what you've told them has actually sunk in. That's the hope anyway.
No, that is so good. It's tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them is so useful. I think a couple of things to add. I think one, wearing my CEO hat, the most powerful, and you both said it in different ways, the most powerful way to get me bought in at the beginning of this presentation is to reframe and repeat to me what you had learned and what we agreed on in phase 1. These were the goals that we heard. This is the feedback that we heard from you on benefits. That immediately puts me into, she's listening to me, she's been listening, and I'm already framed into an expectation, which is that the proposal that we're going to walk through is taking into account all of those things, right? And so that is such a powerful thing that is just so often missing. I think the second thing that is really interesting, and I'm just coming up with this idea too, is this is something that we at Nava do all day, every day, which is help our clients and HR teams craft that proposal. And I think that is some people, as we go through this, could feel a little bit of overwhelm, which is oh man, I've never done this before. This is what you guys are describing as a major level up from how I conceived of this. Lean on your broker partner. If they're worth their salt, they should help you build a really strategic presentation. It's also got an idea and feel free, folks who are on the line, maybe we Nava can kind of provide just a template that we utilize just to give you a frame as a thing that folks can download. If folks find that interesting, feel free to follow up with us in chat or something like that, but happy to do that. I think that could actually be a really good idea of how we go from abstract to, what might great look like here. That was a really good idea, Elle. I think that's actually, I think, quite powerful. So we're talking about the framing, and then maybe I want to get into sort of the kind of first steps. I think the question that we had was okay, we spent a lot of time in step 1 talking about gathering the data, gathering the context. Maybe two ways that we could attack this is like, what are the other elements in that? Like, what are the key components that are in this presentation? Like, what do you include? And maybe what is your first step to start building it? So I think I'm happy to go in either direction. What we're trying to do is go from kind of abstract to concrete on like the big building blocks here of what's in a great proposal. Who wants to take it?
I can start. Yeah. So I think the number one thing is making sure you understand what you have and where you're going. So you've collected all this data about all of the different benefit options that you have, but you need to prioritize them now, right? So you heard the goals the company's trying to focus on, based on what you're hearing on the street and what you think is important to your employees because you've been listening, and doing surveys and maybe participating in ERGs, that they have a desire for something more in a certain area. You have to kind of put that together so that you've got a list that's longer than you can do, because you're not going to get to do everything, but you also want to know that your executive team to know that there's more to do than you can actually physically do. And make sure it's super clear that these are all of the benefits we have, ones that potentially need work, things that, like are great, we should keep them, but we should be doing something different. Here's where we have gaps. And then prioritize. So I think this is the big thing, is that you're going to have a lot to talk about in a meeting with your executive team. So you got to get to a point where they can visually see everything, but that you've prioritized it in a way that makes sense for the recommendation you're going to make. So I actually sometimes like to start with what I think my recommendation is going to be after I've gathered the data. I'm like, okay, I know how big our team is. I know what resources we have. I know that we're not spending more money this year. And so it's really going to be focused around fixing what exists and maybe, trying to save money, right? So if I know those things, then I can go back to my list and say, okay, and maybe you're using a stoplight. I love using the red, yellow, green, because it's just visually very easy to understand. There's no question what I'm telling you. Green is good, red is bad. So putting it in that sense so that someone could look at it and go, aha, there's a lot going on. Some stuff's fine and I might not need to touch it. And there's a lot maybe sitting in red and yellow, but it's listed in a format that I feel like I'm ready to talk about. And I'm saying the very first thing we need to do with our programs, or the gaps that we have in our programs, are clear and at the top. And so it's the organization of now all that data that we've collected, again, with the foresight of, I know what my recommendation is going to be. So make sure that I'm telling the right story and the same story on each and every slide in this presentation, or, notes in my conversation.
Love it. Yeah, Sarah.
Well, and so it's interesting. My approach is slightly different, but I go through the same process. So I would have that same, kind of red, yellow, green spreadsheet. And that's what I'm using when I compare it to the original goals that are set out by the company, or the things I know we need to achieve. And that's what helps me move things up or down, because there could be something that is all in red, but because of the stated goals of the company or the needs around, like, we cannot put more money for benefits this year, I'll just move that down, because I'm like, I know I'm not going to get, kind of buy-in for this one this year.
Yeah.
And for me, that's more in the pre-work stage. And I almost have it as an appendix, like if anyone would like to see all the amazing work and review and all of that sort of stuff. But depending on who I'm presenting to, the entire sheet wouldn't necessarily make it into the presentation. I would reference the work that we had done. But I think for me, the real kind of key in this area is how you're thinking about that prioritization, because it's not just what's broken, it's that red, yellow, green versus what the company is saying we need to accomplish this year. And depending on what that looks like, you could come up with actually very different things that you are going to try and do in the following year that you're presenting to your team, which I know we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe one last note on this, because I think Elle, you were starting to, I think, make concrete this kind of idea of like the kind of benefits options, like backed by data, stoplight encoding in terms of, kind of like red, yellow, green. Maybe like just expand on that a little bit more. Is that actually how you visualize this? You're like, hey, here's an analysis of all of our benefits. Yeah, green, yellow, red. Maybe articulate what the stoplight means.
Well, and it's also not just our benefits or our programs. It's also just the things that we do. Like, because I tend to own more than just like the program, right? I don't just own medical, dental, and vision. I own everything that surrounds well-being and, how we think about employees and their dependents. So it's complex. It's not as easy as like an Excel spreadsheet. And actually I try to avoid using them, even though I know executives love it because it's all clean and they can manipulate. But again, for the appendix, as Sarah said. But the reality is I do it that way because I think that I don't want to have to re-explain sort of what I do and what our programs are, because a lot of my executives aren't using all of the different programs we have, right? Or they don't have a personal connection to like a caregiving benefit. Maybe their kids are, grown, or they don't have, it's a young CEO, he or she doesn't have one. So I think that piece to me, it's because it's visually easy to absorb and understand. And also it keeps you on task, right? Because you're going to go back to it. So like maybe you keep sharing the red, yellow and green slide at the top of each section of what you're going to talk about. So going back to what I'm focusing on, we're hitting number 2 now here. And this is why we're doing it. But also because it can include more than just your programs. And I think it's universal. And that's the part I like about it, is that if I did gradings like ABC, like I don't want to give anything that currently exists an F. Like even if I'm like, oh, it needs a lot of work, it makes me look bad, right? So I think you can make something red and still feel like we've been doing a great job, but it still needs more work, right? And it's about investment, both, financially or in time, in resources, things like that. So for me, it's just an easy, universal way to be able to talk about the benefit programs, the processes, the systems, like all the things that I might own and be part of what myself or my team is working on. It also allows you to dig into little areas. So let's say we're talking about a particular program, your medical insurance. Well, actually, what kind of like employee satisfaction, like you can start digging into like even further into the details about why it has that color now, right?
Yeah.
And you don't need to waste your time on things that are green because you're like, it doesn't align to our goals. It's working fine. And you can kind of just move away and say, now that we're doing a lot of stuff and we're busy people, we're only here to talk about these few things that we think we're prioritizing. That's also nice too, because you don't want to negate like the fact that your team has probably worked really hard on all those greens, right? And so it allows them to see them without us having to focus too much on them. So that's why I also like it too.
I love that framing. Sarah, anything to add on kind of what you include?
I was actually just going to say, so for me, the red, yellow, green exercise is I look at it from a number of different things. And so, I mean, I think in Excel, so I'm going to use that as my mode. But, if you think of different columns, right? So you have a column for the NPS or the employee feedback on it. You have a column for how much it's costing or what the utilization is, right? Are you getting enough utilization for how much you're paying for this benefit? You have a column for, how much of a lift is this for your team, or how much of a lift is this process for your team? Because you could have something that's green and green, but for your team, this is taking hours every week. Okay, great. That's a no cost improvement area that if you're in a kind of constriction year, cool, let's focus on fixing the processes. So to me, it's you take all of those things and then yes, you come up with this aggregate red, yellow, green for the overall line item, but you want to look at it from different viewpoints to help you arrive at that overall score. But also, again, when you're tying that back to what is it I'm trying to accomplish this year, it gives you kind of different metrics that you can look at it and cut it by to decide what the right things are based on your company's priorities for a given year.
I love that. Yeah, I heard, kind of under each program, looking at employee satisfaction, utilization, obviously spend, right? How much does it cost? And then this idea of admin lift, like how hard is it for us to actually execute that? I will tell you from my seat, it is like catnip for me as an executive to see this sort of like stoplighting concept. It really is, because it's so easy for us to kind of zero in on, oh, these look like the areas that we're going to need to explore, change, cut, invest in. So I really like that framing. One question that we talked about before was, how should I think about including benefits that I just know we're not currently using? How would you look at that? Maybe Elle, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so two things. One is when you break down by all these different factors, you already have now answered the question of why is it yellow? Why is it red?
Yeah.
Because that will be, and I always send my proposal like a few days before my meeting, because if you've got a really great executive team, they're looking at it before they meet with you. If you can answer that question very quickly for them, you're getting to the meat of the conversation in this short amount of time that you're probably given, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever it is. So that's the other reason to have these extra columns where you kind of talk about lift and cost and all the other things, because if it's red because it's expensive, and this is where we're going to get into your next question that you just asked, like that's an interesting point. You can just say, look, it's working really well. People love it. It's just really expensive. And so we might need to go to RFP and say, we need to negotiate either with our current vendor or with, are there other vendors out there doing this for less? And so the reason I think you include benefits that people aren't using or that are too expensive or right, we have lots of reasons why or why not they might be in there, is that we don't know the story yet, right? Like, especially if it's something new that you've put in, hopefully you've defined what success looks like. And, you know, if you also have listened to your employees and you've built in sort of like, well, what's the gap? Like, we know we need to, you know, put in a personalized mental health care program. We don't have one today. Like, I know we don't have money for that, but you're putting it in there, both good and bad. All of it goes in there because, again, you're laying and planting that seed that says, this is important. It's a red area. Even though I know we don't have any money, these are things that we need to work on. Or if we're using a benefit or have a benefit that just isn't getting the utilization, but I still think it's important because I'm listening to employees, they're saying they need it. They just aren't aware we have it. It's bad marketing or advertising, or we, you know, don't have the best vendor. Maybe that's what it is. It needs to be in there because that is work that you and your team have to do. And if you think you're going to be thinking about it, touching it, and actually physically doing anything, they should know, right? Because it's kind of, we're in this little gray area where they don't want to know too much because they're like, that's your job, right? But they still need to understand that this is complicated and we're constantly reviewing. Like, I think that, like, one of my favorite things to put on a job description when I'm hiring someone for my team is like vendor management, because listen, I'm going to constantly be asking you to really make sure that this vendor is doing what they need to do. And then layered on top of that, that we're getting the engagement that we expect. And so put stuff down there that you think you might not get because you have to plant the seed. There shouldn't be any sort of wish or desire or gap that you know you need to fill that isn't addressed in this proposal, even if you know it's a no-go. I remember I was doing this with DocuSign around infertility. They were very anti like having a family forming benefit. They're like, that's not who we are. And I was like, I'm sorry, we need this. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I had such a different idea. And so I just kept planting little seeds saying this is really important, until finally one day we had, you know, all the stars aligned and we were able to add it. And it was so important for them to have heard me say, this is important. Here's why it's important. Here's what we're hearing from employees. And this is your opportunity to do that. You're not going to get a lot of, you know, talk time with your executive team outside of when you're doing these processes. So it's important to say the things that you think you're going to need to say to set the stage.
I love that. That really resonates. As we're rounding out this section on just what goes into the proposal, any other considerations that are worth bringing, either sections we haven't talked about or other data points that should be pulled in? Sarah, anything on your end?
No, I mean, for me, I always have a section that's specifically for admin processes. And I always look at how often, how much time is this taking for my team and how frequently are we having to spend that amount of time? Because a lot of times there's just kind of low hanging fruit by improving a process or talking with the team, the wider team of, is there a better way of doing this that leads to a better experience all around and frees you up for stuff that can be a win from your team, from the company perspective. So I always like having that in there. But other than that, no.
And I, just to piggyback on that too, is headcount, right? So if I feel like, oof, you know, I don't know that we're going to achieve all this, but we have to, and maybe we're in a good year where we've got budget. This is where I sometimes will be like, and this is why we kind of need someone to be managing our retirement programs or our financial programs, or this is kind of why we need an admin, or we need a vendor who is going to act as our shared services organization, or, you know, whatever it is, or an app that does that, right? This is also my time to start asking for stuff like that, because if they're bought in to like, yes, let's do these things, and here's how. People sometimes, apps, whatever it is that's going to be able to get all this in. So this is also my time to do that.
That's great. Good stuff. So let's move into the next phase. I want to talk a lot about company growth status, right? Like there's just everyone on this line has a totally different context that they're bringing to the conversation. They could be in an organization that's like, we got to save 40% this year to make it through the year. Some folks are in organizations that are continuing to grow. And I want to think about like the, kind of those different contexts and maybe how we can, provide some guidance there. So when you think about like the companies who are in this mode of sort of cutting back, budget, we were actually just on the phone with a CHRO who that's the mode that she is in right now. She is being asked to reduce their overall spend in that part of the organization by a meaningful amount. And so now we started the strategy, conversation. And what are the top, things that they should think about or implement when it comes to benefits? How do you think about that?
I can start off with this one. So, and we were having this conversation at the start of this, Brandon, that I think for me, it's really interesting because when you are asked to cut something by a substantial amount, the place your head first goes to is, how do I change my plan design? How do I raise a copay? How do I raise a deductible? How do I do this thing that is going to impact the entire population? And for me, what is difficult about that particular approach is that's a very slippery slope because, okay, you did it this year and you made that savings, but if you need to achieve additional savings in future years, like where do you go from there? Do you continue to make your plans less and less supportive of employees? And Erin, you have that slide about, kind of the impact, the downstream impact of financial stressors on your employees. It's on their sleep, it's on their, it's on their mental health. They're not performing as well in work if they are now starting to worry about their family's financial status or getting to a point where they can't afford their health care, right? And so this is where I think you also have to look at, but what is my landscape of the other companies that I'm trying to get talent from, or that I'm trying to retain talent and keep away from moving to those other companies? And reminding the C-suite of that can be helpful. But I think when you are in that kind of that we need to do significant cuts, the great thing is when you have that spreadsheet of, hey, here are our costs, you can really start to see, okay, well, here's some benefits that honestly, not enough people's utilizing them and we're paying this amount. So that's kind of a less impactful takeaway. But there are also kind of other offsets to consider, right? Of if we offered voluntary benefits, are there any sort of kind of rebates that we'd get from that could then use to offset some of these other fees? Do we have carriers that we're coming up to the end of our term and we could actually approach hey, we'll pay for utilization, not a PEPM, and achieve savings that way? But I would also say cutting is, to me, one of the most important places where it is our job as benefits professionals to be thoughtful and push our C-suite to challenge their assumption that all we need is $1 million savings this year. It's like, okay, but what is the impact on our employees, on our retention, on their ability to work and not be stressed if we do this all through the medical plan? And actually say to them, do we really need that? Or is there something else we could do where maybe it's a little bit less, but we're getting all of these other benefits because now we're not spending money on recruiting, or, because we're retaining our current talent. And this is where it's kind of our job sometimes to challenge the CFOs and say, I hear you, but let me give you a different lens. Let me tell you the story of why this might not be exactly what you want to aim for. And here's what I think we could achieve that might not be as disruptive, but still gets you towards your goals.
Yeah. And I think, defining disruption too, because I think the thing is, like, I don't know that they know how closely tied, like, attraction and retention is to benefits, because we as leaders haven't done the best job at turning that data into the story that they hear, right? And generally, it's not the first thing someone raises their hands and says, oh, I left because Salesforce's benefits are better than yours. Like, it's a lot of things, right? But it actually really matters, especially when we start talking about the things that matter to dependents and families and things like that, right? So that's one piece. But I also think that, agree, we should not be just going immediately to, like, let's change the deductible or the plan design. I think negotiate. Make sure that your broker is doing this on your behalf first before you try to, go break yourself and try to do it. but they should have some sort of economies of scale with all the different vendors and say, hey, I know what y'all are charging, all your different, like these folks, they're committed, they want to renew. Let's get them a good number. The other thing is like Sarah said, like PEPM is hard, right? And there's no incentive to get more people engaged, just switching the way that you're paying for stuff. But also actually going out and looking at other vendors. There's so many new point solutions and vendors in the space that sometimes just going out there and seeing what else is there might give you a leg on some savings. And the other thing is consolidation. Some of your vendors might be doing a little more than they were when you first signed with them, right? So maybe you had Care.com and Grace and Papa and all these caregiving solutions, and you're like, oh, actually, like Grace maybe does all of that now. Like, now they're in the chronic care space and the critical care space, and they're doing this for cancer. And I was like, oh, maybe I don't need all this other stuff. That actually has been huge for me, because I find that if they're really good at this one thing and everything else they're adding on is sort of in the sphere of, that one thing, that it's going to be great. And again, employees tend to want to just go one place and know everything. So consolidation is another area where I tend to find a lot of savings, and then I don't have to touch my core medical program.
Those are great. I heard so consolidation of point solutions potentially. Obviously looking at low utilization solutions and saying, hey, is there just a high ROI business case to be made to bring that spend back into the organization? I think a third thing that I heard from both of you too is just the power of starting early and negotiating to create a competitive environment. I just cannot be underestimated. Like, this is one of the biggest things that we see is just the lowest hanging fruit when we look out in the market. It's just like, if you start the process early, and again, this is where you should be leaning on your broker partner for it, you can create real alternatives to whatever the existing, whether it's medical, which is the biggest, or point solutions, and it creates negotiating pressure on the incumbent. And I think that's just such a powerful one. It takes real work, and that's why you hire a partner. I think one thing that I'd add too is, especially when what I hear from our HR leaders that are feeling the kind of cost pressure, is they need to be able to present alternatives that could achieve that goal, and then be able to articulate the pros and cons of making that decision. And like, that's what I want as a CEO too. Like, if I give you the mandate, which is like, hey, in order for this company to survive and thrive, we've got to do X. What I want is, hey, here's a path to X, and let's talk about the pros and cons of doing that. And so that oftentimes, so what we're doing a lot of times in this vein of how do we present a compelling benefit strategy that also takes into account like real need to be tighter on costs, is we go out and do the heavy lifting to go, here's 2 alternative funding arrangements that save us 12 to 14%. Here's the implication on abrasion, or here's the implication on friction, or here's the implication. And then we get to have an adult conversation about, do we want to deal with that, right, collectively? And so anyway, super powerful, really important. And then if folks can make an informed decision. Maybe we flip this script a little bit and just spend a couple of minutes on, let's say you're an organization that's in that kind of where things are going well or we're growing. I'm curious to have, kind of get your feedback or thoughts on how they should think about, how those HR leaders should be thinking about, kind of orienting around when they're thinking about their benefit strategy for organizations that aren't in that like cut, reduce spend mode. Elle, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So you should never, I think, ignore where you can save, because you still want to but maybe now you get to reinvest as opposed to save and then that's it. So still work with your brokers and make sure that you're getting the best rates, that you've got those, amazing vendor partners, the point solutions make sense. I'm also really big on like what can run through claims if you're self-funded, right? Like funding arrangements is a great way to save money. So if it makes sense for you to go self-funded, if you're at that size or it makes sense, it's great. And then are there point solutions that can run through claims instead of being direct billed? There's a lot of things in there that I think are really interesting. When things are going well and now you're getting into maybe a little bit of a wish list, like, okay, great, we've identified those gaps as we talked about early in your proposal. We have things that we need to fill in for, or things that we want to enhance. Maybe it's it's about lowering that deductible or saying, you know what, this year we're going to hold the cost share for employees out of their paychecks the same. That's an investment because we know you're probably spending more on your benefits, right? How can we do that? Is this the story we want to tell? And so now it's about where are we going to either spend more money or more energy or more time for our employees. And you've got to have a really good story. So you go back to all that data that you filled, you go back to your proposal and you say, we're going to look at these red and yellow areas. And some of it will be, maybe we need to go do an RFP for, a new vendor in a certain space. And then maybe some of it is, we're actually going to enhance a few things. We're going to keep costs the same for employees. We're going to actually lower our deductibles so we're closer to benchmark. Or we're going to add a whole new point solution that we hadn't thought of that really focuses maybe on a more of a well-being piece of the pie that we wanted to fill in, right? It isn't just one of the core benefits. So I think, one, it's a fun place to be if you're lucky enough to be in that area, but it doesn't just have to be about where are we going to spend more money, but how are we going to spend it more wisely and really hit those goals that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and I will say that one of the things I've actually taken to doing over the last couple of years, because what I've discovered is, as with any of us, memories are short, right? And so a change that I made 2 years ago that saved the company X amount of money year over year, we've forgotten about that by the time I'm pitching the next thing. And so I've actually started keeping a spreadsheet of like, hey, we made this change. This was our estimated savings, so that anytime I'm asking to reinvest, I can kind of pitch it more as, hey guys, we saved you this money with this program. And so this is how we're reinvesting that same money. Your costs aren't changing, but this is what we're doing with it. And that kind of sometimes can make it go more smoothly depending on who you're dealing with. But I've really enjoyed that piece, just to be like, hey, remember when we did this thing that actually netted us a lot of savings? Like I'm cashing in on that now because I want you're supported in making something else more robust or better for our employees. And I think, especially when it comes to the well-being pieces, and this is where I'm going to reference, and you already pulled it up and shared it, but that slide again. So when you're dealing with the C-suite, so many of them, their heads are either they're dollars people, and they don't necessarily think about what those other impacts are, right? What is the cost of missed days of work? What is the cost of employees that aren't working optimally, that are tired, they're not sleeping well, they're stressed? And if you can start telling those stories, then some of the pitches you might want to make for, I'm going to call them softer benefits, i.e. not core medical, dental, vision, but the ones that I think us in the benefits realm know are actually very helpful, care for families or help with, people with aging parents, how much of that time that gives them back to then focus on their work. That's the story that you need to be telling, because just doing it, saying something like, well, this is something our employees will appreciate. For many higher levels out there, they're like, that's great, but give me more of a case for that. And so I think that's where being able to start talking about some of the statistics out there, and you can do Google searches and find really interesting statistics about the amount of time that people miss in work, or the amount of distraction because they're taking care of these aging parents, or because they're having these chronic conditions that they're supporting. And then you can look back to your claim spend. And so this is that storytelling piece of, how am I going to connect this with what's been happening on our medical plan and why this is in our best interest? Now, obviously, if you're level funded or self-funded, you get more benefit from bringing in things that will help control or better route your members to better care. But even if you're fully insured, I still think it's a conversation that's worth happening, so they know that you know what's happening on the plan and are thinking of, how can I make this plan not only better for our employees, but actually give them better outcomes, which makes us better as a company, even from a brass tacks point of view.
Love that. Elle, do you have something to add?
And I was just going to say, you've already built your list. You've got your reds listed right there. You already know what you can focus on. So if you're in a place where they're like, your budget is the same, we're not taking anything away from what we promised you at the beginning of the year, you already know what you want to talk about, and you've already built out sort of on the side there, like all the pieces, the cost, the lift, the satisfaction, like all the pieces that you need. And you can add some of those stats in, right? Like, oh, this is actually going to impact, employee well-being in the areas of sleep and anxiety, blah, blah, like all those, like you can even go further and add a couple more columns to your document. And I think that's really important too, because you've already halfway done your work if you're already at that point where you've got your spreadsheet. So by the time you know that you've got a budget or that you've got a plan sort of forward in terms of where you think your executive team is already bought in, go back to your story, your data, all of those elements, and make sure that you're still sort of bringing everyone along to the same stuff you've already addressed before. So.
And can I just, for anyone who is listening to this that is sweating bullets because you're like, oh my God, I haven't started on my sheet, my red, yellows, greens, and this just sounds like so much. I think the biggest takeaway, both from the last recording and this way, is start somewhere. If you don't have the time, because you're a team of one, you don't have the time to do the full analysis of all the programs and all of the, things you'd like to do in addition to the things that you currently have, then just start with what you have. And start with the bigger ones of what you have. Start with your medical, dental, vision, pharmacy, and then just throughout the year, when you're in any of those lull moments, but when you are in those moments where you can kind of breathe a little bit, then just spend an hour that week and say, okay, I'm going to do an hour this week, I'm going to do an hour next week. It doesn't have to be this gargantuan task of, okay, I got to spend 15 hours on this spreadsheet and it all has to be perfect. All of this stuff is iterations. You can change it every year, you can improve on it every year, but start somewhere.
And my favorite takeaway from our last conversation was get your broker to do this for you. I mean, they know your benefits, right? Like, get them to at least start it for you. And if they're not, then maybe it's time to change. Honestly, like you shouldn't actually have to recreate the wheel here. Like, there should be a list somewhere already that exists, and they should be able to fill in even some of those columns, right? The cost and, all of this, how much have you spent? And they can even do some year over year analysis for you if they've been your broker for a while. So use them. And then remember, once it's done, once you have one, it doesn't change much year over year, right? You just get to add in all the fun things that you did throughout the year. You update some pricing. And that's the beautiful thing is, if you can get it done this year, and maybe it does take you longer this first year to get it, every year it becomes easier and easier. So if you are sweating bullets, just know that it gets better.
Couldn't agree more. I think that is our view is that is your broker's job. That's kind of what we built Nava around. And so just delegate like crazy. And that's a very good litmus test. Like that is key. I think that one other thing that just really resonates with me, that is something we try to just operationalize into the presentations we put together for clients, is on any proposed addition or change to benefits, like a new point solution or X, I, as a CEO, really love like that as the moment to pair the data that supports it. So there's a handful of data sets we typically use. Number one is benchmarking. Here's what our peer group does with that, benefit. Number two is the results of step one, which is employee surveys. Here's the data points that support, and even anecdotes actually that support why. And then I think that third one that Sarah said, which is like, data that indicates kind of like ROI on that benefit, if that's relevant. You can lean on your vendor partners too to give you some of that data, because that is like core to their business case. Let's keep going. I think now next we wanted to get into how do you set expectations with your leadership team to set this process up for success. So this is almost, I think about this as kind of the project management side of this. One is like, how do you build a great strategy that takes into account goals? And now it's how do you work the process so that you're bringing these folks along and folks aren't surprised, you're not too late or too close to the moment. Sarah, you were talking about this before the call. So why don't we start there? Like expectation setting, super important with the leadership team, getting this kind of project management started. You've had the conversation about strategy in session one. We're talking about the actual deliverable itself. Where do you go next in terms of kind of setting that motion up with the leadership team? Sarah, you want to start?
Yeah. So I would say that to me, what you present in your final, like, hey, we're sitting down and it's official, should not be a surprise to your leadership team, because hopefully you've had enough water cooler, lunch line, hey, I just wanted to get your feedback on this thing, continuations from the original strategy conversation, that they're not surprised by anything that you're bringing to the table, because they feel like you asked them what the priorities were. And then you've had little micro interactions where you're like, hey, I was thinking about this. What do you think of that? And again, remember, people like to have opinions and they like to be asked. So, the more casually that you can make it and build those alliances, or you were like, hey, I was talking to Bob over there and he thinks this is a great idea. What do you think? And now suddenly he's like, oh, Bob's already on board. Okay, cool. This is interesting because you're talking to the right people. So I would say those micro conversations, but then to your point, Brandon, about the just the planning timing wise. So a mistake I made early on is I kind of knew ish when decisions had to be finalized, but I didn't actually go to our finance team and be like, hey, what is the actual date that this needs to happen? And so I think it was my first year in this role. I was like, okay, I know it needs to happen like in July. And then suddenly the finance team was like, hey, do you have your decisions? And I was like, I just had the meeting last week. We haven't finalized stuff, because the meeting is the starting point a lot of times of a little bit of compromise, or a little bit of, okay, now I've taken your feedback, now I'm going to come back to you with a new proposal. And so you need to know when you have to have that in by like the actual deadline, and then plan to have the meeting well in advance for that, so that there is room for tweaks and re-proposals if you need to come back to them with something a little bit different. And then again, if you're building the story and the deck well, for them, this is going to feel like a continuation of a conversation that they have been aware of since the start of the year, which is really nice, because you're like, as I'm going to remind you what we talked about in January, and then this is what we had that, coffee, conversation about. And so they're like, oh, yep, I remember that. Okay, here's where we landed. Now
I love
that's,
it.
ideally.
Well, and this is right, that like they should know, like you've already told, like my favorite sentence at the beginning of every exam, as we've discussed previously. So this is why, one, I always get them the deck a few days in advance, so that hopefully we start this conversation and keep it succinct and clear, but also why you should do this. And just super simple, like put things on their actual calendar, right? Work with their EAs if they have them, like simple stuff. But like, if you know that drop dead date, right? Like Sarah said, go backwards and say, if I need a coffee meeting in January, and then I need maybe a lunch meeting in February, just start putting those things on the calendar, because when they get busy and things will probably move anyway, this just gives you some of that leeway to say, I should be talking to this person or these people a few times before I get into this meeting. And I also think it's important that you always have an agenda for your meeting and something to share with them, if you can, in advance of the meeting, so that they kind of know what they're getting into. Nobody wants to be surprised. And I loved that comment, because if it's sort of like a performance review, like you don't want to be surprised if you're getting like a really bad performance review. You should know that things have sucked all along and just be like, well, that's what it is, right? Never surprise an exec with like, oh, I need $1 million for a mental health care program. Nobody's going to say yes to that. So the other thing is like, not that I ever studied psychology, but I know, and maybe it's just my personal relationships, where when someone else thinks it's their idea, they're more likely to say yes, right? Because it was their idea. So that buy-in, the idea of the buy-in is super important. So being able to say, I've got 3 recommendations. Here's the pros and cons, like Brandon mentioned before. Here's my strong opinion, and kind of already know when you're there that this was something that they had mentioned before, because you planted that seed and they're like, that sounds like a good idea. I'm like, based on how you thought that was a great idea last time, this is my strong recommendation. And it becomes a no-brainer and easier for them. And that's all you want. If you can actually walk out of this meeting with the decisions, I always, my very last slide in my proposal, and you can steal this for your template, is I actually put key decisions that need to be made, and I put them all down, and I say, here's how much it costs. And then I put a yes and a no, and I sit there and I go into editing mode on my PowerPoint and I say, do you say yes or no? And I just start typing, because if you can get at least half of them, if not more, yes, no, like you're kind of already done, right? And then you say, oh, great, it looks like we have 3 maybes in here. You have some questions. I know what they are. I'm going to come back and we're just going to focus on those 3 instead of having to redo this whole thing over. So I always close with, the things we know are yeses and nos. And if I get a hard no on something that I really want to be a yes, I might keep including that in the conversation. I won't maybe accept the hard no. But if you have a hard yes, then great, like done, like close it. Don't even bring it up again, and move on. And I think that's also really important. You're getting their buy-in early. You're telling them it's their idea. They're saying yes. And you could walk out of that meeting with your final decisions. Only once has it ever happened to me that they just said yes to everything, and then we walked away, and then I never talked to them for a whole other year. It was amazing. It probably won't happen, but if you can get a couple, I think it's great.
So good. I think, just to recap, I think these are really powerful. These are hugely important things. I think one is work back from that decision date and put the meetings on the calendar. That's like foundational to what we do. 30 days prior to the actual lock-in date, we've got the presentation, and then expect a follow-up conversation. And then Sarah, to your point, like the small pieces of kind of socializing the considerations and decisions in the months between now and that decision date, so powerful. I think that's just a huge pro tip in terms of how you kind of navigate it. And like success is, this is a continuation of a conversation, not a cold start, drop kind of a book on someone, on their lap and say, hey, here's what we want to do. Those are awesome. I know we got 5 minutes. I had one last question that I wanted to just dig into with you. It's really the emotional side of benefits decision making. And so the question is this, making these benefits decisions for an entire employee population can just be heavy. It's just heavy. You're trying to support everyone. And how have you dealt with that in your career? And maybe just advice to the HR folks that are on the call around, kind of just how to manage through that feeling, that heaviness is you can't do everything for everyone, and especially in 2023 as we go into this environment. Maybe Sarah, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So for me, it's a couple of things. If I have that logic ahead of time and I know why I made the decisions that I made, it makes it so much easier because again, this is not, I didn't do this because I like this group better than this group. There was a business logic behind it. And sometimes the reality is we have to just kind of put our hearts in a little box to the side because we're like, this is what we had to do. And us, depending on the company, that transparency level, guys, this is what we had to do so that we can keep doing well as a company and getting that buy-in. The other thing that I learned my lesson on recently is always preparing for the worst, right? It doesn't matter what the decision is. There's going to be somebody that has a criticism of it. And so before I even announce the decision, having made that email or how would I answer someone that's like, that was the worst decision that you have ever made. Why did you do this? Having that ready, then you're not reacting and you just kind of your copy paste. You're like, thanks, Jim. Here you go. And that was some, and so ours was very funny because we made a change to some of the vendors that we were using and it was a vendor I didn't think people would like have feelings about. They did. And we had our answer ready to go, but had I had that ready to go before we even made the announcement, it would have gotten rid of the, oh gosh, people aren't happy. How do we respond to this? So I think that prep can also be helpful. And also knowing that this is an iterative process, right? We made a change this year. If it doesn't work, do you know what? We'll change it back. We are not like, we will put something in and take it back out if it doesn't work. And just because I did something this year doesn't mean I can't, change it again next year if circumstances are different.
That resonates. Elle, anything else to add?
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna +1 to all of that and just say I think being prepared for whatever happens makes whatever happens just a little bit easier to take. I've had to learn, I'm deeply empathetic. I've had to learn to not take a lot of the hate personally because not everyone's going to be happy. I'm lucky that I haven't had to take away a lot of benefits in my lifetime, but I've made decisions that people are definitely not happy with. And been surprised by them, much like Sarah, because I was like, what? I didn't even think you cared. And here we are. And sometimes it's like 3 people care. So like, obviously it was the right decision. It's 3 people, but they're the loudest little 3 people that you ever did see. And they're friends with the CEO. So they're, emailing your CEO. Again, being prepared and ready and making sure that nobody is surprised all the way up to your CEO that you've made this decision and you have a clear reason as to why. One of my biggest mistakes, I think, in the history is that, I made decisions around like, oh, we're not actually changing anything except for a vendor, let's say, and then not told everyone all the way up to the CEO that this was happening. And they go, oh my God, did we make a mistake? And if your CEO thinks you made a mistake because they weren't clued in early, that's the thing I'm scared of, not my employee yelling at me, right? So make sure everyone's aware. They've been clued in all along the way. Be prepared for the answer. And then also remember to take care of your own, mental health during this process, because actually it is a little bit scary, right? Like, did I do the right thing? I'm very connected to my ERGs. And sometimes I'm like, man, I know they want something and I just can't give it to them this year. I'm pretty transparent about that when it's going to happen. And I'll sometimes even give them a heads up like, hey, we just didn't get that thing that I know you guys really wanted this year. It doesn't mean I'm not thinking about you and that I care deeply about the thing. But my mental health sometimes comes into question when we're going in here, because I am empathetic and I care, and it's why I'm in a role like this, which is I know why most of us are in roles like this, is because we really want to fix healthcare. We really want to make a difference and help people, and you can't always. And so again, on top of being prepared, having the right answers, talk about the business case, it still might not feel good. And so remember to take care of yourself and be confident in that you're doing the best that you can with what you've got. And sometimes it's not going to feel good. But if you have faith and know that you've done all the right things and you've listened to, Sara and I and taken all these steps, that you did all that you could. And I think that's really important. And honestly, I think most people, they get it. If you have a really great message and a clear, transparent message, I think they're going to get it, even if they're angry.
So good. I think that's a great pausing point. Thank you so much, Sara. Elle, thanks everyone for joining us too. A couple of things just before we drop. I think there were probably a number of kind of follow-ups here. I think we're talking about a template on what great looks like when it comes to that presentation. We're going to own that as a next step for folks who've joined. And then also we're going to be sending everyone here an invite for session 3, which is all about how do you implement this stuff. And so implementing what to do, how do we get through open enrollment? It's going to be really tactical in nature. We're going to try to really get into the concrete stuff to help you, help you avoid big problems and take this thing to the finish line. Also, I know we didn't get to a lot of Q&A. So if you have any direct questions for myself or Elle or Sara, please just send them to me at brandon@navabenefits.com. We will get you answers. And also we're doing another thing at Nava, which is a benefits audit. So we'll just do a deep dive on how are your benefits looking in terms of how they benchmark and in terms of cost and and completeness against your peer set. So feel free to email me. We can kick that off as well if that's interesting to you. And then finally, last but not least, thank you, Sara and Elle, for just always being great co-pilots on this. A lot of fun.
Thanks, guys. Love the conversation.
Yeah, so good. We'll talk to you all soon.